Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, September 24th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about the Harvard Youth Poll, a poll done amongst young Americans aged 18 to 29 across the United States, releasing their most recent findings, showing Kamala Harris opening up a 31-point lead over former President Trump. Now, this poll is one of the few polls taken across the United States that is primarily focused on young Americans. And this is something that I think we really have come to understand recently over the past 2 months since the entrance of Kamala Harris in the race, is that she has somehow changed the way that not only do people across this country, but more specifically focused on the youth electorate, how they perceive this race and perceive her candidacy and their chances of voting for her in a presidential election. Now, what we know is that the youth poll here has been doing polls for a few decades now, 2 decades now, doing a number of different data points and sourcing a lot of different information that help us understand how young people perceive American politics and what it looks like, especially in a midterm or presidential election year. Now, the most recent data point we have prior to this 31-point lead for Vice President Harris was their last poll that they conducted in the spring, showing President Biden with a 13-point advantage. So yes, the numbers have completely flipped from 13 now to 31, a 31-point advantage for Vice President Harris, and what is likely going to be only increasing between now and Election Day. And young voters across America really do make up a significant portion of the population, especially when it comes down to an untapped resource for Democratic Party voters when they look at where they can actually see improvements off of their last election's overall enthusiasm gap, and also just generally where they can source voters of beyond just the traditional outlets at which they do engage with in campaigning, right? When you look at things like the campaign texts and the campaign emails and the campaign mailers and the door knocking and the phone banking, a lot of that is very much geared towards older groups of electorates. Honestly speaking, based on voter turnout numbers, also the more engaged groups of electorates. But young voters, I think, in this election feel particularly increased in enthusiasm and excited about a Vice President Harris candidacy on the national level, and that's something that we now see in terms of a tangible form when it comes down to polling data. The Harvard Youth Poll is one of the most accurate polls when it comes down to gauging young American sentiment, especially in a horse race capacity. In a Donald Trump, Kamala Harris, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, Democrat-Republican matchup that they have been able to come to understand to be one of the most accurate pollsters, again, when it comes down to young Americans, which puts a lot of validity behind their name. And the 31-point lead for Kamala Harris is something that I do also believe has room to improve. What we find is that roughly 9% of young Americans simply don't have an opinion or don't have enough information or do not want to make a decision between that of Vice President Harris and former President Trump, which arguably shows there is still room for growth for Kamala Harris. Now, I want us to unpack a bit more than just the national headline here of a 31-point lead. The Hill and USA Today and a bunch of different news networks have come to take this poll and really analyze it in a bunch of different ways. But I want us to actually take a look at the actual website from the Harvard Kennedy School Institute of Politics, looking at the Harvard Youth Poll, how they introduced this poll, what they find to be some of the more top lines here, and what I've sort of compared to their most recent data points from the past spring poll that they conducted just a few months ago. And so really in unpacking it, I want us to go through there. But the Hill really did gauge a number of different points here that I think really explains why young Americans are so in favor of Kamala Harris and where this base of support really is coming from and where this large swing, again, of that 13-point lead for Biden that he had before now to a 31-point lead, again, amongst young Americans. We've spent a long time talking about how there has largely been decreased enthusiasm for the Democratic Party, largely under a Biden reelect. And a lot of that came from more left-leaning, younger voters who came into this election more optimistic and hopeful, but felt very stifled by a Biden candidacy, felt like they were getting more of the same. It was an election rematch, and a lot of it could be the fact that Donald Trump was running again, right? There couldn't be as much of a difference in an election that was nearly identical to an election that felt like it consumed most of America back in the 2020 election. And so what they have found is that there's a widening gap in voter enthusiasm between Harris and Trump voters, especially amongst young voters. Kamala Harris's supporters have a 15-point advantage when it comes down to enthusiasm in this election. And it isn't just that, too. They're finding that voters, especially voters of color, are shifting away from where they used to be a bit more unwilling to take a side, to pick a candidate between Biden or Trump, and now seemingly are shifting far more towards Kamala Harris. For instance, amongst young voters, Kamala Harris has seen a 30-point bump in support amongst black voters compared to Biden's support in the spring survey. In just around 3-4 months, you're finding a 30-point bump amongst a demographic group that Democrats were already starting to see some bleeding about and were worried that bleeding wasn't coming from older voters, but rather was coming from younger voters that Kamala Harris is starting to reel back in. They're also finding, too, that white voters in the spring poll broke for Trump by 2 points. Now, on traditional values, right, that kind of makes sense based on traditional polls, rather, that kind of makes sense because it is something that isn't really too far out of the question. White voters are the most pro-Republican group of voters by any racial demographic in the United States. But this is amongst young voters. Young voters overwhelmingly lean towards the left. And so Trump leading that by 2 was an early warning sign that Biden was losing key and crucial support amongst young voters across the United States. But today, Kamala Harris is up 15 points. And a big reason for that is because there are probably some young voters out there, especially white young voters, who are more apathetic to the election, just simply did not want or did not have an opinion because, again, it felt like more of the same. But now Kamala Harris has changed the race, and she's changed it in a way that has made young voters feel more excited and more willing to vote for Kamala Harris in the election. And I find that to be something that really has changed in just about 2 months, something the Democrats probably could have foreseen in theory, but has really panned out to be one of the most successful operations in reeling back in young voters, college voters, recent graduates, non-college educated young voters. This intentional effort across the board, whether it's Gen Z specific marketing, whether it's campaigning on college campuses, whether it's focusing on youth engagement and voter registration, so many different efforts and a combination of factors here, obviously propelled by the top of the ticket candidate here, Kamala Harris, really showing that young voters are much more on board with Kamala Harris than they were with President Joe Biden. And so they talk about this significant enthusiasm gap on the USA Today article. They also talk about a widening gender gap, doubling from 17 points in the spring poll to 30 points now. Kamala Harris leading 70-23 amongst likely women voters. What we know, too, is that women voters, female voters across the United States, are the most likely gender group to vote. They are also a bigger portion of the voting population and the regular population. And they also just so happen to be the most beneficial for Democrats across the country, which is why we started to see on general basis when there's swing state elections, special elections or state legislative elections or any different election that voter turnout used to be low for Democrats and thus Democrats lost the elections. Now we're starting to see Democrats start to do better in those off-cycle elections, in those special elections, in those elections where historically Republicans have done better in, and in the aftermath of Roe v. Wade, where it is an omnipresent reality for voters across the country, specifically women, that their right to choose, their reproductive freedoms are on the line constantly and always. It does drive people out to be more pro-Democrat and also more likely to vote in election after election. And when it comes down to key personal qualities and issues, Kamala Harris far outperforms Donald Trump. On honesty, climate change, abortion, gun violence prevention, healthcare, empathy, relatability, these are things that are the vibes contest of this race. And quite frankly, amongst young voters, Kamala Harris is winning it. And something, too, that we've started to see, that job approval has gone from 32% to 44% for Kamala Harris. 32 to 44. Very similar to what we saw on the national scale. And what we knew really is confirmed by this youth poll, that voters that are younger tend to be more critical and unwilling to say they approve of a candidate, right? 61% of young voters in this poll are saying, I'm backing Kamala Harris. Just 44% say they approve of the job she is doing. Very similar story to what we saw with Biden's approval, in that a lot of young Americans, even from the beginning, felt like they disapproved of his job as president of the United States because he wasn't left-wing enough, or they didn't feel as enthusiastic to back him. Kamala Harris seeing a 12-point increase is substantial, but it does show that she is lagging a little bit when it comes down to overall approval. But even then, the results are putting through that 61% of young voters are backing Kamala Harris's candidacy for the White House. And when you take a look, too, at overall policy points that we see Kamala Harris, and also not even just Kamala Harris, but also progressive policies in general, young Americans like things. 74% of them say they favor capping prescription drug prices. 59% support a nationwide law to legalize abortion. When we talk about the future of this nation and the future of voting demographics, sure, the gender gap is expanding, but there are some issues that people are pretty consistent on, and the Democratic Party has been winning on those issues, like capping prescription drug prices. You see that as one of the main things Joe Biden was mentioning when he was running. Now Kamala Harris is mentioning capping insulin prices for seniors, and mentioning that Republicans were the one who axed it across the board. Legalizing abortion nationwide, Republicans and Donald Trump are the ones who axed that across the board. Now also, too, in relation to Project 2025, there's an overwhelming rejection, is how they put it. Just 6% of young Americans view it favorably, 48% view it unfavorably. The Democratic Party's messaging and strategy at pushing out all of these talking points around Project 2025, and just publicizing Donald Trump's blueprint for a second term, as the way that they put it. It is looking so bad and so grim for them on that front. It is clear why the Heritage Foundation announced that they were disbanding Project 2025. It is clear that despite putting 919 pages of policy plans in writing, directly mentioning former President Trump over 300 times in the Project 2025 blueprint, that they are now completely trying to pull away because it's so negative. It's a toxic brand, and it is driving not Republicans, but Democrats out to vote. And that just 6% of young Americans view it favorably, despite 30% of them saying they are voting for Donald Trump. And just 14% of Republicans, young Republicans, find it favorably. And so across the board, there are so many different metric points that we have seen consistent improvements for Kamala Harris. Improvements that really drive why she is now leading by quite a significant amount nationwide. You can see that amongst college students, there's a 20-point shift in favor of Kamala Harris from where Biden was, right? You're seeing that massive shift nationwide isn't just happening because on one end, right, Kamala Harris is winning over one demographic. It is across the board. Improvements amongst voters 18 to 24. And of course, an improvement amongst voters 25 to 29. An improvement amongst suburban voters, rural voters, small town voters, Democrats, people in red states, people in blue states. Overall, every single racial demographic, there is not one point really where we've seen it walked back from Kamala Harris in comparison to Biden. And that is a really good sign because, again, it shows that there has been massive improvement, but there still is room for growth. And when it comes down to why young voters do matter in an election, I point us to examples like the most recent 2022 midterms, where now we're starting to see articles pop up about how college towns are decimating the Republican Party. For example, when you move into a university like Temple University or Penn State or the University of Pennsylvania, if you are moving into any of these states from out of the state, right, into Pennsylvania, at a very big portion of what we've seen in terms of Democratic Party politics and organizing, and even Republicans too, is they encourage these new voters who now have arguably a permanent residence or a full-time residence in the state to change their party registration, especially if they come from a safe state, to now vote in a state where their vote might be more meaningful. And what we know too, especially in relation to the data points that are coming out of this youth poll, is that college-educated voters and voters in college are more likely to vote blue than practically any other combination of age and demographic, education demographic, across the country than any other group nationwide. And that is why you see Democrats really try to drive out youth turnout on college campuses. When you're taking a look too at 2020 election results, when you take a look at Ann Arbor, now this is a county and this is a city in the state of Michigan that holds the University of Michigan. Now, what we remember back from the 2020 election, a number of different precincts here really broke down quite significantly in favor of Joe Biden. Some precincts going so far as to being a 96-4 split. Big reason for that, the University of Michigan is here. And the University of Michigan split in a way that was so beneficial to Joe Biden because this race did ultimately come down to the wire. But Michigan's not the best example because it's a state that was decided by 2.8%. Pennsylvania or Georgia are better examples. When you take a look at Atlanta, you see that there are a lot of universities here, especially some out-of-state students, going to Emory, going to Savannah College of Art and Design, going to Georgia Tech. And while it may seem meaningless in the grand scheme of things, right, an influx of 10,000 new, out-of-state students in a state like Georgia, in one university in particular, might not make or break the overall election. But considering Georgia was decided by just 11,000 votes in the last race, absolutely every single thing matters. Because if just, 10,000 more voters or 12,000 more voters, as Donald Trump put to Brad Raffensperger, if 12,000 more voters were found at a random college campus and decided to vote for Donald Trump, he would have won the state of Georgia. Now, sure, he would not have won the election, but now in this race, given that it is coming down to the wire and every individual state matters arguably even a lot more than it did in 2020, every single vote matters. And what this youth poll is telling us pretty much reaffirms many concerns for the Republican Party. The bleeding that existed under Biden does not seem to exist under Harris in the same way. Now, she's underperforming Biden's 2020 numbers from the fall, which is why, again, I say there's room for improvement because we did see that improvement. The numbers of Biden from 2020 in the spring were not as strong as they were in the fall. And the fall poll has not been released yet. And so we're looking at a preliminary poll that has been done. The earlier set poll that started taking place in the summer ended up being fielded now. Now they're getting the results. There's another poll set to come out. And likely, it's in the field already, you're going to start to see more information. And so what we are finding, just on the grand scheme of things, is that young Americans at large are backing Kamala Harris in a way they simply did not back Joe Biden. And that matters. when everything is going to come down to the nitty-gritty in these 7 battleground states. Think about it for a minute, right? Think about the University of Wisconsin. Think about the University of Michigan. Think about Penn State. Think about UNC, the variety of different UNCs. Think about Duke, right? Think about Emory. Think about UGA, right? Go Dogs, right? Think about all of these different universities that really do matter. Think about Arizona State. Think about UA, right? Think about Nevada, UNLV, all of the different college campuses that really do make a very big difference in the grand scheme of things that we don't spend as much time focusing on. But this poll in particular shows exactly why the Republican Party is scared and why they were so scared in particular about Kamala Harris's candidacy. And we will see after this election just how inspired or not young voters were in this election. Because right now, based on what we're seeing in the youth poll, Democrats for the first time in this election cycle at large are winning in the enthusiasm gap. They're even doing better than they did in terms of enthusiasm to vote for one candidate in particular than we've seen in many recent election cycles. And it's really good news for the Democratic Party. And Democrats are very much inspired by what we're seeing with Kamala Harris. Sure, Republicans were already engaged with Donald Trump, but this, again, is something Republicans really cannot rebut. They don't have a group of young Americans that are willing to turn out for them the same way that Democrats do. And the youth poll confirms, again, many of the suspicions many Republicans had and really goes to show. If the Republican Party wants a future to be the dominating party in electoral politics, something needs to change in terms of how they interact with young voters and how they campaign to and with them. Because right now, the Kamala Harris campaign and the Democratic Party at large are winning them by a tremendous amount. And it seems to be very difficult for Republicans to combat that in really any capacity. This election, though, will be close. And this will just be one piece of the puzzle should Kamala Harris win the election. But young voters will be integral if she does. There is no pathway to the presidency without young voters. There is no pathway to the presidency without organizing on college campuses and in surrounding college areas and reaching out to young Americans with just a high school diploma, young Americans in trade school, young Americans in the workforce. Young Americans are a piece of this puzzle, and they could be a very big one for Kamala Harris. But if it doesn't pan out and young voters don't turn out, there is no pathway forward to winning the presidency without young voters, which is why it's significant news and massively, massively good for the Democratic Party at large that they have now seen nearly a 20-point improvement off the poll that was conducted just a few months ago in the spring from the same pollster, one of the most accurate ones, the Harvard Youth Poll, Harvard Public Opinion Project. Look it up. One of the most accurate pollsters when it comes down to young Americans in the nation, showing this 31-point lead with potential room to grow. It's really good news for the Kamala Harris campaign, but not enough to say that this election is locked up and wrapped up, but definitely a good position to be in, especially in comparison to where President Biden was just a few months ago. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.